You will find someone that doesn't want cleaner air or a cleaner stream. We all want that. I think the key is finding the balance, and I think the balance has been out of whack, where you cared more about streams and trees and rocks than you did about people and their material well-being and the dignity that they can have having heat and electricity. And so there's 8 billion people in the world, so you're not going to have a situation where there's no environmental impact. Now, I think the fatal flaw we've been making, Europe certainly made it, was to think that if we don't do it, it doesn't happen. When in actual fact, the answer is that if we don't do it, it happens much worse.
Hi, I'm Stuart Muir. This is Power Struggle. Today on the podcast, I'm thrilled to welcome Heather Exner-Pirot. Heather is a senior fellow and director of energy, natural resources, and environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. And she's also a special advisor to the Business Council of Canada and a research advisor to the Indigenous Resource Network and global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Heather, welcome to Power Struggle.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be here, Stuart.
It's great to see you today. There's so much history we have. Maybe we'll get into some of the things we've done together. But really, I just wanted to get right to the point in these interesting times. What do you see as the most pressing challenge that Canada is facing on the global stage today?
Wow, great question. And I have to, before we get into resources, then I guess I have to say the role of the United States in the Western Alliance and the stability of the liberal world order. And that's a big problem to have. So when the United States is saying that it wants to invade, annex territory, whether it's the Panama Canal, Greenland, or even jokes about Canada, and you're putting out through some executive orders, which I don't think would normally stand through the test of the Constitution, I think that's a big problem for Canada as part of this Western Democratic Alliance. But we have some tools in our toolbox, so.
You've been writing recently about some of the approaches that Canada should follow. You had 6 pillars that you identified. I'd like to come back to those, but what do you think is the most important one of those?
It depends on the time frame. I guess, our most, this is just world history of the 20th and 21st century. Oil is king. Oil is king in the commodities world. Energy is king in the security world. And Canada happens to have a ton of it. And we are the world's 3rd largest exporter, 4th largest producer. And we have enormous reserves that certainly won't exhaust in my lifetime. And I had to give credit to Newfoundland Premier for this line, is that in this game of chess we're playing, energy is the queen. And I agree with that. We have quite a few assets, but oil is by far the biggest.
Well, oil takes us into energy security, energy transition, because those have been at the center of so many debates. What do you see as the evolution of these discussions? Because some of these ideas, particularly energy transition, if we look at recent policy moves in the U.S., like pulling out of Paris Accord, where are we headed in that regard?
I mean, I don't think one presidential term really affects, an energy transition when you're talking about, global energy supply for 8 billion people. The United States is big, but it's not that big that it can affect what everyone's doing in Asia or Africa in the next 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's why I've always thought, regardless of policy in Western democracies, what will drive oil demand or not is, the ability of people to afford it in the developing world. And for me, energy consumption will increase until global population plateaus and starts to decline. And we are certainly reaching a peak baby. I think we may have reached this year where we've seen as many babies born in the world as we'll ever see born again. And that means that peak population will follow, in about 30 years or so. We'll see between 20 and 40 years, let's say. And then oil consumption may very well decline after that. I also think nuclear has tremendous possibilities, tremendous runway. That's also great for Canada from an energy security perspective because of our incredible uranium resources. But anyways, what Donald Trump does or doesn't do, I don't think will be a rounding error on the history of oil and global supply and demand.
One of the things you write about frequently is how Indigenous communities are at the center of everything, at least in Canada and probably some other countries, when it comes to resource development and the provision of the things that the world can't get by without. So tell me about partnerships and what's happening in that space between industry and First Nations, Indigenous communities.
Yeah. Well, why don't I dive a little deeper here, Stuart, since we have the time. But
yes, we do.
People, it's not a DEI initiative to respect Indigenous rights in Canada. This cannot be wished away. It cannot be legislated away because it's in our Constitution. And there's also, it's an inherent right and protected, to some extent at the international level too. But anyway, shape or form, governments and proponents who are smart are trying to be good at this, not try to get around it. And so to describe to you what is protecting the Constitution, it is a recognition and affirmation of Aboriginal rights. And there's pretty good consensus and lots of legal precedents that what that means is partly an ability to practice their culture, which includes hunting and gathering, using these things for cultural reasons. So almost any resource extraction, probably in particular hydro, mining, oil and gas, those will have an impact on Aboriginal rights because it has an environmental impact. And so the condition, the task that must be met is that there's a duty to consult and a duty to accommodate, that there's some reasonable accommodation. There is no right to a veto. There is no right to have zero environmental impact, but there's a need to accommodate the loss or the impact on Aboriginal rights. And so since that duty to consult and accommodate was affirmed around 2004, 2005, that has really changed the game in Canada. And again, proponents who want to artprint in Canada are working on doing this better. And we've gotten pretty smart in the last 2 decades. Probably, despite all the challenges in BC, it's encouraged people to get smarter, in particular BC. So some of the things that we do is procurement, training, just pure payments, could be milestone payments for how a project proceeds, could be royalties once a project is already proceeding, the loan guarantees that provide equity. And now we're trying to think of, what are the missing gaps? What other kinds of programs could you have to do? And the end goal here is really a win-win, that industry benefits, Indigenous communities benefit, that you have alignment in their goals. And so projects can move forward at pace, but that everyone benefits. And that's why I like economic development. Maybe you too, Stuart. That's why I love resource development, because it's not a zero-sum game. Canada is so rich in resources. If we do this right, we can all be very prosperous.
Is there an example, a story you could give us of someone who's really succeeding there?
Yeah, I have a great example. I used to work at the University of Saskatchewan. And there was this one student, and she was Indigenous from Laurent. And, I had created a little loan program for students, as I had heard and realized a lot of them are missing classes because they couldn't afford groceries, couldn't send their school because they didn't have groceries for their kids, and couldn't go to their clinical or their class because they had to stay home and watch, like all these little things that a couple $100 to someone else was, kind of a make or break point. So we had this little tiny loan program, kind of emergency loan program for students, and this I'll say woman, she was young, in her early 20s, from Laurent Jasper. He didn't say why or didn't ask. I just took her word for it. I later found out, Stuart, that her mother had committed suicide, and she needed the money to pay for the funeral. And she paid back that loan. I never pressed anyone. It was kind of an open-ended thing. And all of the loans were paid back, and I didn't mind. She paid back that loan in 6 months while she was still at school, still doing her nursing, 4th year nursing. That's a tough year. And I just thought the different steps that a lot of these students, and Stuart, you're friends with a lot of people in these communities too, what they have to go through to achieve what was, an easy path for someone like me. And there's no one that that's, from an Indigenous and northern remote community that's now an engineer or a nurse or a chemist or a welder that didn't have a harder time getting there than almost every other white person that And that's been my experience with, the dozens of people that I know. So yes, it may take you or your company a little bit of extra effort, a little bit of extra time to mentor or to teach or to be patient or bring someone up to speed. But I promise you that extra 5% of effort that you require, I promise you they're giving 95% extra effort than any of your other employees to get to that point.
That's a real testament to where your work began. I'm intrigued how you then bridged into these national economic conversations. I have to say, kudos to you, Heather, because you're almost always the first or one of the first off the mark to give an accessible, rational explanation to developing news. And I look to you for that. And I think you're increasingly recognized for that. So I think you're clearly succeeding in your analysis becoming available to the many. But how do you go from the story you've described of working with people on campus, and then now you are an influential commentator on global affairs and national affairs in Canada and beyond?
Yeah, great question. So where I started, I think I always make this joke. If you were my age in the 90s and you were kind of leftist, liberal, white girl, you went into international development. Nowadays, you would go into climate change or environmental studies. But back in my day, it was still international development. And so, I did study abroad in Guatemala. I went to South Africa. I did my master's research in southern Chile, all these things. And then came back and did an internship in Geneva. And, so it's kind of always international development, international security, human security. There was an overlap. And then did my PhD in Arctic studies and was working it really went from Arctic security and development to Northern security and development to Indigenous development to resource development. And so I always say that I came into resource development from the back door, from the perspective of how do you make this work, how do you get Indigenous communities and industry aligned? But my PhD was on pretty, standard IR stuff on the Arctic security. And I always kept up with that too. The Arctic Council, for example. When Ukraine was invaded by Russia, that's when my work switched from really kind of that industry, Indigenous alignment on resource development in Western and Northern Canada to the energy security side and the critical minerals, and how do we use this in Canada, to our advantage and to advance our own values and interests. And that was when MLI created a program out of it. So I think, for everyone, the zeitgeist switched. Obviously, there's we think about 1991, we think about 2001, and now I think we'll think about 2022 as the year that, the world changed. And my position changed with it because the world changed too.
Your journey, Heather, is interesting. I relate to that. I suspect a lot of people relate to this because you've come into being a commentator on global affairs, but the natural resource side of that because of your social interests. Mm-hmm. And I look at it the same way. I mean, it to me, the greatest beneficiary in Canada and any country where natural resource is a large driver of the economy is governments because of the tax revenues. You stack up all the benefits. Like there's no company that makes more money than the governments do out of responsible resource development. And then it's on the government to distribute the benefits of that to the people. So I think the most genuine position that could exist in Canada is to say, to support the people, we need to make sure this is done right. Because if it isn't and things get mucked up and the benefits aren't there, then we're going to see a loss of quality of life, first of all.
Yeah, and I'll tell you my origin story in a way, Stuart. I remember I was working at the International Centre for Northern Governance and Development at the University of Saskatchewan, and Cameco was a big funder of that, and a lot of our students were coming from Northern Saskatchewan, and it was as a way to recruit and a way to get social license, but it was a very good thing Cameco was doing, and I think they're ahead of the curve in Indigenous industry relations, and obviously a very powerful
uranium mining company.
Yes, uranium mining company, and we can get into it, but Saskatchewan has the richest uranium reserves in the world. And then we're one to exporter in the world right now. I remember my boss at the time doing a radio interview and talking about how, the Indigenous communities wanted to see more development. And I was just new to the job at the time, coming back from Geneva. And 24 years old in Saskatchewan, and that was the first time in my life I had heard someone talk about a positive relationship between a mining company and Indigenous communities. And then you start to wonder, why haven't we heard this before? Because then when you start to get into it, and Stuart, when you work with communities and when you work with industry, they usually have quite close relationships, closer than certainly they would have with Ottawa, either of them. And so started to explore that. This was at the time of the last commodity cycle. The commodities boom in Saskatchewan had a big impact on Saskatchewan psychologically when we went from a have-not to a have, almost permanently. Now we're the second richest province generally. And that was a big change. And also that was a time where Indigenous communities and their economic development corporations were really starting to get into the supply chain. And all the conversation was about was how to prepare people for the supply chain, what kind of training, how to set up, good governance and boards for economic development corporations, all that kind of stuff. It was, it was development and governance, it was. And then the Wet'suwet'en blockades came. And I saw from a national media perspective what I thought was just a pure distortion of the situation. Knowing, as I did intellectually and from knowing some people in the communities, that most 20 First Nations had signed on, that people, and I knew the work, because I had done it in Saskatchewan, I knew the work it took to develop those economic development corporations, to get those contracts, to get that procurement, to get people trained up, to get them certified, to go through their safety, to get their 3A, all the things that you have to do to have that opportunity. And no one even saw it. You were staring right at it with their eyes, and not a single media story, or I have to say government of BC or federal government, no one saw that side of the story. And that's where I say I got radicalized and made it, my life's mission to celebrate and platform and boost those people in Indigenous and Northern communities trying to do something good for themselves and for their communities, and to not let Southern naysayers who don't know anything about their lives or what they're trying to do undermine them from afar.
Would you agree there was a carefully managed spectacle for the benefit of the media age and the different channels by which people communicate? That was in contrast
agree.
to the story on the ground. You agree?
I absolutely agree that environmental NGOs, and I had seen his work with my work on the Arctic, by the way, and there had been a huge, people will probably remember this, the big Greenpeace campaign, Save the Arctic, in 2008. And again, where I had been working with several Indigenous communities, and on the North Slope of Alaska, where the Inuvialuit, I think it was, had been, were quite prosperous, had the wealthiest Indigenous economic development corporations in the world, had real rights to the money coming in. In fact, that Alaska Settlement Act, Native Settlement Act, came out of the fact that there was oil wealth in Alaska and wanting to pave the way for some, governance of it, amendment of resources and sharing of resources. So I knew what Greenpeace was saying, and where people were dressed up as polar bears in Paris and Berlin and New York was not at all, and I'm not saying it was, totally unanimous in Indigenous communities, but I knew people affected by it in those communities wanting to choose for themselves and having their choices absolutely limited by what environmental activists were doing in the South to feel good about themselves, while still burning oil, of course. And I remember another radicalization moment. Greenpeace had a Save the Arctic t-shirt sale, $100 cotton t-shirts. And the money went to Greenpeace, of course. It didn't go to communities or anything. It went to fund Greenpeace. And I thought the hypocrisy and the atrociousness of selling cheap cotton t-shirts, which have an environmental impact, which have a labor impact, in the name of saving the world and thinking that you could save the Arctic, and just totally disrespectful, not even including voices of the communities there. And the seal hunt had been the same way. Again, that was an eye-opening moment. And once you see it, then you see it everywhere. And I saw it everywhere in the Wet'suwet'en blockade.
Well, it's not that difficult to find Indigenous voices of leadership who are looking for opportunities, including projects, resource projects, but lots of other things, who find those snatched away because an artful and clever campaign has created a certain picture that is influential with regulators or decision makers, and puff, it's gone.
I agree. And I'm taking some solace, even though we're living in very, trying times with a lot of volatility and a lot of fear, I'd say. I have seen, I'm sure you've noticed, Stuart, in the last year, certainly I would say in the last 3 years on the Indigenous side, where you don't have to be quite so brave to speak out. And you've known people, and I could name a dozen Indigenous people who, when they first had to say, I support oil and gas, or I want this project for my community, how they were belittled and destroyed and demeaned on Facebook or social media or in the media, called corrupt, greedy. I've seen, you see cartoons of, caricatures of chiefs with the briefcase stuffed with money. We've come so far. And now in the last year, and I think even in Canada with this Trump threat, where people are saying, Prime Minister Trudeau just said it, our resources are what make us powerful, and that's what the United States need, and they'd be crazy not to take it. And we want to develop these things, and whether it's, steel, which needs iron and metallurgical coal, or lumber, or food, the grains, the canola, the natural gas, the uranium, the germanium, all of these things are what gives us our hard and soft power on the world stage. And it's not just you and I and our friends that see it anymore, Stuart. I would say this is a very healthy majority of Canadians have come around to this conclusion now also.
We've come a long ways from Canada should be known for its resourcefulness, not its resources, haven't we?
I'll never get tired of throwing that back in some faces.
There's bound to be someone watching this thinking, well, it's all well and good that Indigenous people should have opportunities, but it can't be at the price of the planet. Maybe there's cycles and shifts in views, but I think there's always going to be someone having that concern, and maybe it's a little bit at the back of everyone's mind. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, of course, you will find someone that doesn't want cleaner air or a cleaner stream. We all want that. I think the key is finding the balance, and I think the balance has been out of whack, where it's been almost misanthropic, where you cared more about streams and trees and rocks than you did about, people and their material well-being and the dignity that they can have, having heat and electricity and, their own car, all those things that we shouldn't take for granted. And so there's 8 billion people in the world, so you're not going to have a situation where there's no environmental impact. Now, I think the fatal flaw we've been making, Europe certainly made it, was to think that if we don't do it, it doesn't happen. When in actual fact, the answer is that if we don't do it, it happens much worse in much worse places. Obviously the offshoring to China has, spurred tremendous amounts of coal use, far lower environmental standards, far lower labor standards, and of course security challenges with that too. And I did do some analysis, Stuart, and maybe you saw it, but in almost every case of major commodities that I looked at, and it was mining, it was agricultural products, it was energy, in pretty much every case, you can think of one or two, iron and bitumen, but in every other case, the Canadian commodity was in the top decile, maybe a handful of cases quartile, but mostly top decile of environmental performers. And so we're talking about they're already the best in the world. They're already A grade. So to think that by making it harder for those in that top decile to conduct their business in Canada is better for the world by shifting their production to China, where now they're getting a D grade. Now they're in the bottom quartile of environmental performers. That was a big mistake. And I always say this, your best climate strategy, export more Canadian commodities, because in almost every case, it's going to be better. There's going to be lower emissions for that product in the world. And why is that? It's not just because, we're better people. There's some fundamental reasons why. We're colder. So in many cases, you just need less energy for some things. All AI, if you care about the environment, should be in Canada because you need less energy to cool it. Because we have a lot of hydroelectricity, and you know that in BC, so you have a lot of renewable electricity. Our grid is quite clean compared to other major industrial countries, and using natural gas instead of coal. And that's going to be 50% better in your emissions for anything you do. And whether we like it or not, most industrial practices still require some industrial heat. They cannot be electrified. They do need that, that thermal heat. And it's far better to do with natural gas than with coal. And our natural gas is actually quite a bit better. And we capture our methane from production of natural gas a whole lot better than almost everybody else. So again, for all these factors, not to mention the relationships, the ethical relationships with Indigenous communities, the labor standards, for all these reasons, if you care about the environment, if you care about ESG, then in almost every instance, you're better off with the Canadian product.
It feels like you've gone from being a provocateur to almost mainstream as many people see what you're talking about. How is it you're getting through now and maybe you weren't before?
I mean, part of it is just, the world's a scarier place. And it was a luxury for us to be able to focus on climate policy and put, tens of billions of dollars into EVs or green hydrogen or, some other things. Not to dismiss it, but it's a luxury. And I always, for me, it's the hierarchy of needs. For if your readers aren't familiar, but it's, basically look at a pyramid, and the bottom is your material needs and your security. We're talking about shelter, the ability to avoid violence, and then you might get into, a higher order, and the top is self-actualization. Anyways, it's all fine and good when you're a rich, comfortable society like Canada to start, wanting to focus on the environment and feminism and equality and inclusion. And those are good things. But if you don't cover that bottom layer of the pyramid, people's material well-being, then you cannot sustain the top. And we stop paying attention to the material well-being, Stuart. So anyways, when times are tougher, people go back to, how am I? How is my family? How is my household? And that's very natural. And so I think there's an easier story to tell to people about, there's nothing like an energy crisis to make people appreciate affordable, reliable energy.
Mm-hmm. It seems that Canada has a lot of energy options, maybe more than almost every other country in the world. Who has uranium and hydroelectricity, wind, solar, gas, oil, coal? What else? What am I missing in the abundance that Canada has? Is there anyone?
No, there's nobody. And I've seen, and I saw it once and I could never find it again, so I couldn't cite it, which, bothered me. But that Canada's the most energy secure country in the world. But I believe that to be true, because who else might be close? United States and China are also very large, and they're also huge producers in a lot of these things. They even have our uranium, and they don't have our hydro either, by the way. But because they have such huge populations and internal demands, it almost comes out flat, where they're huge producers, but they're also huge consumers. Where Canada and I would say Russia and Australia are a little bit different is that we have smaller populations, huge resource base, and we can export most of it, that we don't need it for ourselves. So, and I think there's power that comes from being able to export. People don't know China's a huge oil producer. They don't know it because China doesn't export oil. And so it isn't able to play that card, isn't able to use it to advance its interests. In fact, it's still a net importer, and so it's still quite, vulnerable, and that's why it's stockpiling. Australia does not have oil. That's a big disadvantage. I don't think it has the hydro we have. And Russia doesn't have our uranium. That's one area where it's very important that we do beat Russia. Russia is a huge enricher of uranium. If you've ever heard that people want to get off Russian imports of uranium, it's the enriched stuff, and they get that raw material mostly from Kazakhstan. Anyway, so yeah, I've thought about this a lot, Stuart. You and I think the same. Can anyone top us? No, on a list of 6 things, we'll be right at the top.
It's just so intriguing. I wonder if there's anyone who's thinking, okay, so Canada's got all these resources and thinks it's a blessing. Well, you're wrong. It's actually a curse. There's some academic theory around this Dutch disease. Is having this abundance a curse?
Great question. There is some good theory and practice of a resource curse, where a country can become too reliant on a resource, and you do see that in lesser developed countries. It's certainly not necessary, and the greatest example of that is Norway. Where you had good governance and you had resource wealth. That is definitely a sweet spot. Australia also is a very resource-heavy country, more resource-dependent than Canada in terms of the profile of its economy. Obviously, it has used that for its benefit. And then I'll say some of the Middle Eastern kingdoms, like Qatar, again, have used their oil wealth, their natural gas wealth, quite in a clever way, and have become quite wealthy societies. So the resource curse isn't destiny. It's a risk, but it's not destiny. Canada has the history and the governance and the parliamentary tradition, all those things that we have fairly well avoided that. Now, why are we embarrassed? I want to get to this, Stuart, and it could have been the answer to your last question too. I have often wondered, why would the Laurentian elite, if I can say that, if it's not too provocative, why would the Laurentian elite be embarrassed about our resource wealth? And I've heard this, and I know you've heard it too, that we're mere hewers and haulers, and we would like to move to a knowledge economy. To think that resource sector is for grade 12 dropouts who drive big trucks. There's certainly that feeling that it's a 20th century economy. It's not a 21st century economy. And I think as we urbanize, as 80% of Canadians, live in big cities, that they've been disconnected. They have not seen farms. They don't know where their food comes from. They think their food comes from the grocery store. They think their ham comes from the deli. They've not seen the pig. And they think their furniture comes from IKEA. They have not seen the forests and the mills, and that supply chain. They think they plug in to a plug in the wall. They don't understand or think about where the electricity comes and all the steps come before that to get their electricity. They think their heat comes from turning up the thermostat. They don't think about the pipe and the gas and the production all the way. And so I think it's the disconnect in our urbanized 21st century society that people have taken for granted because it's made it so cheap and affordable and reliable, you could take it for granted. Taking it for granted is a great luxury, a great thing that we have. But I think people need to appreciate that if you don't take care of those things, and that's the situation we're in now, if you don't take care of those things, they will not be cheap and reliable for very long.
We've been talking about Canada. We're next door to a country that's in the news a lot at the moment, the United States. What are the energy relationships? How reliant is one on the other and vice versa?
If you ask me, we are fully interdependent. And it'd be like removing, what's it called when a Siamese twin?
Okay.
It'd be so hard to remove that Siamese twin, the veins and the vessels and everything. You're going to bleed out. So, and this has been built up over a century. This is not something that we started in the 80s and you could, slowly roll it back. Our grid is perfectly interdependent. Our pipelines are almost perfectly independent. Our refineries. So, not to, we're talking about raw materials, but I'm talking about the transmission lines and the pipelines and the refineries and those things. And if you look at any map of electric, networks and of pipeline, this is a continental endeavor. And one thing we have to offer, and I think we all know this, which is a blessing, this is a silver lining, we all know this, is that the United States imports, even as they become the world's largest producer of oil, they've kept importing more and more Canadian oil as their imports of, OPEC oil or Russian oil has gone down. And so that this month, in fact, the United States imported a record amount, more oil than any other country has ever imported from any other country in the history of the world. 4.4 million barrels a day on average in that first week of January. And it may well, be that this week and next week and next month as well. And so you cannot replace, 4.4 million barrels, especially, and people may know this already, but in case that a lot of Canadian oil is of the heavy variety. That's the grade it is. A lot of the refineries in the Midwest and the Gulf of Mexico are optimized to process Canadian heavy oil. And so it's not that easy to displace that heavy oil with their lighter, which is why they import Canadian heavy and export some of their sweet light crude of shale because the refinery system doesn't want it or need it. And so it's, we do have some leverage here, and it is against American interests at the end of the day to not take advantage of this incredible access, not having to cross ships, not going through the Red Sea, not going through the Panama Canal, crossing a pipe over your own border of this very secure supply of oil.
Is there a danger that someone who thinks, who's a resident of the U.S., thinks that making America great again necessitates making Canada not great?
I think we all know who in the United States might have that feeling that we're dealing with someone who's, in an extremely powerful position and sees the world through a win-lose perspective. And this is, it is a tumultuous time for sure. But America is more than Trump. Canadian-American relationship is more than one president and one prime minister. And like I say, we've been developing this interdependence over 100 years economically through world wars. And, maybe we'll be in a rough ride for a year or 2 years or 4 years. I hope not. Maybe we will. At the end of the day, if, you believe in realpolitik, just the politics of pragmatism, it's in the United States' interest to use Canadian resources. It's in Canada's interest to sell them our resources. And we may go through some volatility, but that trend is going to be clear, I think, across decades.
Going back a little bit when we were talking about the benefits and how we describe them for natural resources, because the Canadian economy really is a resource economy. If you consider the life cycle of some valuable resource, maybe it's a timber or a natural gas or an ore body like uranium or copper, and it exists there. And there's things that will happen to it before it becomes a product in the marketplace, a whole lot of things. And I think there's some economic analysis that when you break down all of the things that create that commodity as something that can be put onto a ship or a rail car and then it moves along, that contrary to maybe the popular notion, certainly one thing that came naturally to me, I would have said, well, the value in that evolution is to be had at the end where you've got the manufacturing. You're going to make way more money, and the economy you want to have is making things. That's how you get rich. All that stuff, like you say, the hewing of wood and hauling of water, there's nothing in that. But actually, if you look at it, au contraire, am I right?
I mean, statistically, yeah, let's look at this, both sides of the equation. This is Statistics Canada. I think, you and I know it, but maybe not all your listeners know it, but oil and gas is the most productive sector of the economy. The value you get per hour worked is in, the high, I've seen some where oil sands is $1,000, but others I've seen about $700. Depends how you count. If we're talking about average, median, that kind of thing. But where the average Canadian worker generates, let's say, $52 an hour for Canadian GDP, an oil sands worker will do $700, $800, $900. Mining would be almost the next highest productivity. And it could be as high as $600 for a potash worker if potash prices are good. But usually I think an average about, somewhere around $250, between $200 and $300 anyways. So those workers doing that primary extraction are providing a tremendous amount of productivity and GDP to the Canadian economy. And it's not low-skilled work. That's what I find insulting, maybe from Western Canadian perspective, to think that the oil sands is easy work and not to appreciate, the engineering genius to figure out how to take that product, which was not worth much in the 70s, and turn it into, and I did the analysis with Brian Ramillard a few weeks ago, we spent $1 trillion, in capital spend and operational spend on that project. It has generated much more than that to the Canadian economy. That's just the spend. And so we turned it into $1 trillion asset. Because of engineering genius, you know what I mean? Of figuring out how to turn that bitumen into something that's economic. And same with all kinds of mining, and same with all kinds of resource development. That TMX, you and I met a couple months ago to celebrate TMX. As Ian Anderson pointed out, he was the CEO of the project until a couple years ago. That's probably the best pipeline in the world. Yes, it was certainly over budget, and I wish that hadn't happened so. But when you look at the engineering that went into creating TMX and the standard it has, and it's the Rolls Royce of pipelines that we now happen to have in Canada. And okay, we might just need a Civic. I hope we just build a Civic next time. But to put a pipe through mountains and to do it in the way they do it, it takes engineering brilliance. And so I just wish people would appreciate what the chemists, what the geologists, what the engineers, what the financial guys do. These are very highly competitive, world-class sectors, and you don't get there just because you have a good deposit in the ground. There's lots of places that have ore bodies in the ground. They're just sitting there, and we've got a few of those out.
And I would point out that the example you just cited, the Trans Mountain Pipeline that goes from Edmonton to the Vancouver area, it was built with the approval of 50 First Nations, and that approval was secured by Ian Anderson. You've mentioned his work. Why do you think they approved it?
For some of it, and people should know, sometimes these great deals that you hear about came down to the CEO. And Ian Anderson should probably have a statue in downtown Calgary because the oil that we can ship through and the royalties Alberta gets from. But he did the work of having a chief-to-chief relationship with so many of those nations where they felt and they did, could call him on his phone and he would answer, negotiated. And again, this part of the cost, it didn't need to be $34 billion. But you won't maybe mind as a Canadian that we spent a little bit more money on it to avoid some very important cultural sites, to avoid harming some particular species. And that they listened to and even righted some wrongs from the 1950s version of Trans Mountain, where that was kind of done and just pushed through, no consultation, did not care what the local community thought, and righted some wrongs of what that pipeline did in the past. And now they will get economic benefits from it. So again, that's an expensive example, but it's still also a good example of how industry and Indigenous groups can come to an alignment, can find a win-win.
That kind of brings us full circle back to conversations you've been having about energy resources reconciliation. And I mentioned this early on. You have identified 6 factors that will build Canada and its future prosperity. You mentioned a couple of them. We talked about those, but I'd like to go back to that and just list through them and just try to put that out there because there are 6 factors that every Canadian needs to know. Yeah,
thanks, Stuart. And but my thinking too was in this time, very Canadian, is just a hand wring for the last 2 months of the ways in which we're vulnerable to the United States. And to remind everyone that, guess what? We're enormously rich. We have an abundance of everything, and that makes us very powerful if we would like to exercise it. And we have a ton of options of using our resources to advance, our prosperity and our security, and that of our allies, by the way. Everyone knows, and it won't be a surprise on your show, I disagree with what the Trudeau government has done. They've made very damaging policies. Some provincial governments have made some damaging policies, but beyond that, what do you want specifically to fix that? We can all complain all day about what's been done, but what specifically should we do to improve the situation? And that's where this list came from. So number 1, more pipelines. And I think that's obvious to everybody. But to be even more specific than that, Northern Gateway Pipeline and Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Pipeline. First of all, because a lot of the legwork has been done, and so they'll be able to get done easier. Second of all, because it diversifies us away from the United States. Third of all, because it's beside the resource, it's beside the oil sands, it's beside the Montney. And so logistically, I think it makes a lot more sense. And fourth of all, because I think Asia is an obviously growing market, regardless of what you might think about, plateauing demand in the United States or Europe or whatnot. I don't think anyone reasonable would look at the demographics of Asia and say that there's not going to be more energy demand there. And so that's, so pipelines number 1. Number 2, reform the Impact Assessment Act. That's Bill C-69, no more pipelines bills. And now we're all, it's a mantra that we need to repeal it or reform it, replace it. Specifically, what do people want? You can't just repeal it. You can't have the Canadian federal government not having an environmental assessment because they have some constitutional duties to do some of this, and they would be sued if they just did nothing. I think the easiest way to get development, to get investors, proponents interested in Canada again, is just to be so narrowly focused on the constitutional division of powers that the federal government, I almost don't care what the Impact Assessment Act says. I don't want it to touch mines. I don't want it to touch refineries. I don't want it to touch, oil sands. So it can say what it wants, but it should not apply to any of those things that are under provincial jurisdiction. And natural resources is under provincial jurisdiction. Nuclear is a federal responsibility. You have to have, it's not going to be Alberta, deciding what capital powered, regulating its nuclear plant if it does one in Alberta. It will still be the Canadian Nuclear Security Commission. It has to be under our international treaties. So they should be excellent. The CNSC should be excellent nuclear regulator. They're pretty good. They still need interprovincial pipelines, still have to be a federal jurisdiction, so that's the Canadian Energy Regulator, they have to be good. And then there's some things on federal lands, ports, that kind of thing that you might still need an Impact Assessment Act agency for. The third thing is on nuclear. And this was maybe the most provocative or the most kind of forward-thinking one is, obviously we had this great uranium. We actually have in Ontario quite a good nuclear sector. I think the next logical step, thinking of the next decade, of energy and thinking of Canada's place in the future is for us to start enriching uranium, which is a very small club Our CANDU reactors have never needed enriched uranium. They use natural uranium, so we've never had to import enriched uranium. But OPG, Ontario Power Generation, is building right now a small modular reactor. Saskatchewan will probably build a few, and I think we'll have more SMRs and microreactors in Canada. That means we will need enriched uranium, and I think we start doing it, and I think it's a tremendous export opportunity.
And just to break that down a little bit, because it's an interesting thing you touched on, and it's important to understand. So Canada has enormous, in Saskatchewan, uranium deposits. And by the way, British Columbia voted to ban exploration for uranium, which that's a side conversation. But Saskatchewan has most, or if not all, of the commercial potential
All the production,
uranium, all the production, and yet we ship it out to other countries who then process it. Why didn't we start processing it here a long time ago? Is it because it's very hard or expensive, or we don't know how to do it?
I mean, there's nothing more regulated in this world than enriching uranium, because you need this uranium to make nuclear weapons. And that is one reason why, I think, decades ago, Canadian engineers developed the CANDU reactor to use natural uranium. And so the difference, is that I think it's, about 1%, U308, whatever it is. I can't remember the exact formula. And in a light water reactor, you'd need 3 to 5%. In a micro reactor, you might need this high assay, low enriched uranium up to just under 20%. And after that, they probably won't let you do it because you're getting to, weapons grade. So we do, and I had to, Cameco does, and it did, because we started in the 50s and we were a bit more ambitious in the 50s. They do mill, they do conversion, and they do fabricate CANDU fuel. So they do some steps in the process of creating nuclear fuel, and they will call it fuel services. And for example, they're sending converted uranium to Ukraine. So they do have contracts that they feed to other people at that stage, not just the raw. But enrichment is hard. It is expensive. Russia has been, as I understand, downblending a lot of weapons grade uranium from weapons that it's decommissioned, and that has in a way flooded the market. So Rosatom and Russian enriched uranium has been the best competitor, I would say, on price. The United States, I think, was getting 20% even of its enriched uranium from Russia. And so now the situation has changed, obviously, where first of all, more people in the West are interested in nuclear and will need more enriched uranium, which, we are in a period of decline before. And also that we can't depend on Russia anymore. And those factors are changing it. Now, if we're going to triple nuclear capacity, which there's 31 countries that have signed on to a declaration saying that, we'll need a lot more enriched uranium. This is where I think Canada has an opportunity to start doing that value add. Because, again, like I say, we're going to start needing it for ourselves for the first time. And in these kinds of days, I'm not in the mood to be reliant on the United States for energy security.
And why would demand for uranium triple?
Yeah, it's the trifecta in electricity. As we all know, this is affordability, reliability, and sustainability. That is the goal. And pick any of your sources, and they'll probably have 2 out of 3. Solar and wind will not have reliability. Natural gas and coal will not have sustainability. Nuclear, for a long time, has not had affordability. Although, Ontario's nuclear generation obviously was affordable. As part of it is just the extra regulations we added after Chernobyl and Long Island. So we need to get nuclear to be affordable again, but we know that is possible because we had affordable nuclear 50 years ago. And so if we can get nuclear affordable again, and that's the point of SMRs, to do small modular reactors, easier to finance, easier to locate, a lower regulatory burden, longer fuel cycle, then we expect that we can have this electricity generation. So it's clean. It's also very energy secure because unlike natural gas that Germany would have to import every single day from Russia, when you have a nuclear plant, you may not need that fuel for a few years. You're pretty self-sustainable for a few. And you can get uranium from Canada, from Australia. There's a few friendly sources that I think, is a feather in its cap.
There's lots of it out there. Okay, so we're looking at 6 things. We've covered 3. We've covered pipelines, legislation, and uranium. Let's go to 4, 5, and 6.
Great. Okay, so 4 for me is earning Indigenous consent. Now, I didn't say requiring Indigenous consent. There is no veto in the Canadian Constitution. But of course, the ideal situation is to earn it and to have it, And so how do we do that? And again, I think the loan guarantee program has been wildly successful. The Alberta program has given out, I think, $800 million. There's a couple $1 billion deals on the horizon. The federal government has adopted it because it was so successful. It's been a game changer, the loan guarantee program. BC has one.
And the loan guarantee program, that's where a government-backed entity is providing guaranteed loans. So a First Nation, which has trouble going to a bank because their property is held communally, so
Correct.
the bank's not going to be able to repossess that land. Is that
Correct.
right? And so the government say, well, this First Nation should be able to invest in that project, but you can't get the money from the bank, so we're going to loan you those funds.
Exactly.
And that's been a game changer, you're saying.
It has been a game changer on pipelines for sure.
Right.
Now, the thing about the loan guarantee program is it works best with long-term kinds of utility kind of grade projects like transmission lines, like power plants, like pipelines. It's not a great fit for extraction. It's not a great fit for mines, and it's not a great fit for upstream oil and gas. And so maintain, build, capitalize that, use that, leverage the kahunas out of that one. But we do need a couple other tools in the toolbox. So what I hope this next government may do, they've talked about a First Nations resource charge where they give up some, but the federal government tax take, that's fine. I think some Indigenous specific investment tax credits, royalty trust structures. I prefer anything where the proponent and the Indigenous community can negotiate it themselves and not have to apply for government things or get approved by the government, because I think it goes faster that way. But in general, if we can all come up with 3 or 4 different kinds of incentives programs that would align industry and Indigenous benefits, I think that's good. Number 5 is on critical minerals. So what would I do for money other than the Impact Assessment Act? I've been focusing less on energy transition metals, battery metals, because of demand for EVs and certain yada yada. But in terms of a security aspect, our dependence on Chinese critical minerals for defense supply chain, it's usually not the big money makers. It's not the zinc or the copper or the nickel or the iron I'm worried about. It's usually kind of the bespoke niche metals that are often byproducts of those. So now I'm talking about rare earth elements. I'm talking about germanium. I'm talking about gallium. I'm talking about scandium. Those things that are not really economic on their own. Those small markets, and China has cornered the market on processing them. But we need them. And it's big leverage that China has been using as export restrictions. So I would like to use Department of Defense spending, D&D spending, part of our 2% GDP spend to meet our NATO requirements to help things like tech in Trail, BC, I would say Rio Tinto in Quebec, everywhere where we're processing kind of these things that have a big market, to help them process those niche commodities that have a smaller market that we actually need for a defense supply chain. There's about a dozen that NATO identifies that you need for a supply chain. So that would help get our processing going and also protect our security. And then the last one is transportation. We all know, we've seen the railroad strikes every time, labor negotiations come up. Just the entire country just braces itself. This is not sustainable. It's not of the national interest. If we need to use our resources for our soft and hard power and to expand our economy, we can't be held hostage by labor action at ports and railroads. And so using some more tools in the toolbox, again, with the Canadian Labour Code. The one I suggest that I think might be reasonable, that came up in the last stoppage, was for the Canadian Labour Code to be changed so that the government can impose binding arbitration before a work stoppage occurs. And so it's not to take away union rights, it's not to reduce their ability to negotiate with their employers. But before a work stoppage, why we don't need to wait a couple of days into the work stoppage to start using some of these tools.
And when you look at supply chains and the complexity of ports and transportation and the expectation that the world can acquire the things it needs from Canada, is your position in number 6 on binding arbitration kind of a signifier of just how important it is to be able to satisfy what the world expects from Canada?
Yeah, I mean, there's an economic side for sure, that you want to be a reliable supplier, that if you're producing food goods or some, mineral product, that you want your customer to be happy on the other side of the world. But also to the point that we're talking about things that are very important to people's well-being. When we're talking about grains, when we're talking about metals, when we're talking about propane, what have you, you can't be playing political games with these things. And so if we want to make some hay, and again, we have an opportunity here. One of our biggest competitors, by the way, the United States, is a competitor on a lot of commodities. They're not looking as reliable maybe as Canada is right now. They're doing, kind of a lot of things. We can compete with them head to head on some of these things. compete with Russia, compete with China, which we want to reduce their market share. So let's make it as easy as possible for our allies and for those who are non-aligned to choose a Canadian product versus a product from someone that I don't think is as benign to world interests as we are.
Heather, this has been a fascinating discussion. You've covered so much ground. Your view of the world is so practical and rooted in the facts. I'd love to end on a upbeat note because I know that when you engage with audiences that I've been in, and even people will tell me, have you seen that Heather Exner-Pirot? She's such a great speaker. Like, I know that in what you research and share, there's actually an incredibly positive vision for the future. And I want to leave the impression as we bring this episode to a close that you are actually an incredibly optimistic and positive and inclusive thinker. And I'd like you to help me bring that home here.
Well, thanks so much, Stuart, for the kind words. And I respect so much what you do, because this is why I love resource development. This is why I love resources and think about commodities of my sleep, is because I think Canada has good values and interests. I think the rest of the world will benefit from having access to energy, minerals, and food that it can purchase from somebody who is not an authoritarian state, is not a superpower that is going to have strings attached, but is someone that is just going to provide you the basic essentials that your people need in a way that is fair, that is ethical, and has pretty good environmental pedigree as well. And that at home, that doing that good in the world, providing things that people need in a responsible, reliable way, actually increases our own prosperity at home. And like I say, there don't need to be losers in resource development. We are so rich in this country. We have such an abundance. We've been blessed. I don't want any poor First Nations. I don't want any poor Inuit communities. And they don't have to be if they can also leverage their resources, and they can work with industry to leverage their resources to gain that wealth, get those jobs, get those revenues, build that infrastructure, all the things that Canada's resource sector has given to us. So if I'm pragmatic, it's because I'm from Saskatchewan, and we always say, get her done.
Well, that's true. Those from Saskatchewan, and we have lots on the West Coast where I'm here in Vancouver, are making this a better place. Practical problem solvers, and we're lucky to have them and you. So I really appreciate that you've inspired and challenged us. I hope you're challenging people, because the show is called Power Struggle, because these things aren't easy. We struggle inside ourselves, sometimes amongst each other, between each other. And because of people like you, I think we're resolving that struggle in a good place.
I hope so. Yeah, we can hope. I think in the medium term, all this nonsense will actually turn out to be pretty good for Canada. Shake us out of our complacency a bit.
Well, I'm happy that's a likely outcome in your view. So we'll come back to you in future and see how it's unfolding. So we've had Heather Exner-Pirot here today, and I'm Stuart Muir with Power Struggle. Thanks for tuning in.
Super. Thanks so much, Stuart.